Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 5.61 and this is our introduction to frequency modulation, aka FM synthesis. Before we begin, just a couple of quick notes. Number one is if you haven't watched the videos on subtractive synthesis and the polysynth, I'd encourage you do so. I really do lay the groundwork for a lot of what we're about to talk about with the FM4. And the second point is that this is really going to be a much shorter series than what we did with the subtractive synthesizer, mainly because the concept behind FM is a lot more intuitive and, in my opinion, easier to grasp than subtractive synthesis. Where people get stuck and confused and smash their head against the wall is actually just with the practice of using FM synthesizers. So all I have to do is show you guys what's going on, why things are happening, why are these bands popping up here and changing? And then it's up to you to kind of try to put that into practice. And it's very hard to do that, even for me, and I love FM synthesis. 99% of the time, I have a bit of an idea what's going to happen, and then something completely different occurs. And that's why watching videos on how to make patches with FM synthesis, if they're actually utilizing FM synthesis, is kind of stupid. Because, it's so nuanced. It's like one additional value here, one additional value there, and that completely changes the sound. Personally, I think you can learn a lot from watching tutorials on how to program subtractive synthesizers. So if you wanted to watch videos on how people make sounds in massive or silent or whatever, go for it, because using the polysynth and understanding subtractive synthesis, you can think, oh, okay, why are they doing this? And that's what they're doing here. And to me, that's going to help you. It's going to make that learning curve that much quicker, especially if there are particular sounds that you're trying to emulate. It should all make sense to you. With FM, it just doesn't work that way. And I don't typically make definitive statements like that, but that's one I do truly believe. And if we just go to the punchline of this document, you can see most of the time when I am working with FM, I have to restart a patch 10 or 15 times before I actually come up with something useful. That's just kind of the way FM goes, and it's why I love to use it. But at the same time, if you want to try to make something really quickly, you're going to always want to go with the polysynth because you know how it operates, you know how it works. So let's get into this document. This is really basic and review for most of us, but it's important to cover these things nonetheless. Now, the first vocabulary word that we actually have to kind of define is a complex waveform. But to understand a complex waveform, I'm going to kind of take the inverse of that and define a simple waveform. There's no such thing as a simple waveform. I'm making this up. But in my opinion, this is a great way of looking at FM and understanding the sort of sounds you can get. So in my opinion, with my definition, a simple waveform, or what I call a logical waveform, a truly harmonic waveform, is a wave whose harmonic spectrum follows a logical, periodic, and predictable shape. And we've covered those already: sine waves, triangle waves, square waves, and sawtooth waves. To me, those are the only true simple waveforms, and you're going to find them on almost every single subtractive-based analog synthesizer you'll come across. So for example, we have the polysynth here. All right. We have our sawtooth wave, the richest of all, even in odd harmonics, and you can see that the cutoff is very, very gradual. We also have our square wave, just odd harmonics, but again, the cutoff is extremely gradual. We can kind of emulate a triangle wave, which is just odd harmonics cutting off at a much steeper slope. And then we have our sine wave, which is just the fundamental. So hopefully we can kind of narrow in on that. All right, there you go. Just our fundamental frequency. And the reason I refer to these as being simple waveforms is because you know what you get, okay? When you load up any kind of subtractive synthesizer or you plug one in, you're going to see those waveforms and you're going to know exactly what to expect. A complex waveform is anything else, Okay, so when you have a synthesizer and it has just weird knobs or allows you to do some wavetable synthesis, you can expect that somewhere as you're turning that knob, you might go away from a simple waveform and start to create something complex and new. It may not have the same sort of logic that you have with a subtractive synthesizer. And I'm just going to show you that quickly here with Massive. And just as a review, even inside of something like Massive, this is like one of the most powerful subtractive synthesizers of all. We have our sine wave, and it's perfect because this is a very digital synth. We have our triangle wave, our saw wave, and our square wave. And the square and saw wave sound pretty much identical to what we have with the Polysynth. So again, there's that repeatability factor to it. But what's unique about Massive is that we also have a slew of complex wave shapes. And here's just one example. You can hear and see that this isn't following the logic of the harmonic series and everything we've talked about with sound up until now. Those simple waveforms are really what I would refer to as being almost utopian. Okay, they're like the perfect example of one of those waves. And when we look at something like this is still our fundamental down here, but there are other harmonics that are being hyped even more. And we have this kind of weird image and pattern. And I'd have to really go in here and look at each and every one of these harmonics to try to maybe establish some kind of rhythm to it, some kind of logic to it. And inside of Massive, we have a slew of these. And some of them are trying to emulate actual like real world sounds. This one's trying to emulate an organ. So they looked at an organ and said, okay, this is what the frequency spectrum of it looks like. Let's have that be one of our basic waves. And this is what they came up with. And there are different positions here as well. So those are what I would refer to as being complex wave shapes. So FM synthesis now is just trying to use, or what it does do, is it uses basic sine waves at its purest form in order to create complex, or in some cases, simple waveforms. So the reason why early FM synthesizers didn't have anything beyond sine waves was because if you knew what you were doing, you could actually get these simple waveforms from using just the sine waves and frequency modulation. So you could recreate a sawtooth wave, or you could recreate a square wave. Unfortunately, with sort of our advances, we've gone away from that principle and we've kind of given people exactly what they want. And we'll be talking about that later on here in the series. So to understand FM, you have to understand vibrato. And at the time, this was like a huge breakthrough when people were able to take these tone generators, these oscillators, and have one oscillator modulate another at a sub-audio rate so that you'd get just a nice cyclical pattern-esque modulation. And in the case of vibrato, we're talking about modulating pitch. Okay, so just like an opera singer can sing and get vibrato, we could then do that in the synthesis realm. But what happens when vibrato speeds up and that modulator moves from being a subaudible frequency to an audible frequency? That's when true frequency modulation starts to occur. So when the modulator reaches an audible frequency, the carrier, aka the audible oscillator, distributes the energy to new harmonics, which are referred to as sidebands. And we can just look at this very quickly here. Unfortunately, we don't really get this to work per se, but what I could do with this patch, we have our sawtooth wave there. I can take this LFO, have it modulate the pitch by a particular amount, whatever I'm feeling. And that's vibrato. It's not natural vibrato, but by its definition, it's modulating our pitch cyclically. So I could change the speed. And there you go, a little bit of vibrato working on that sound. So what happens then when we speed this up into an audible range? Well, it's not as if this oscillator is going to suddenly start making noise, but what it is going to do is it's going to take our fundamental. So if we were able to get this more of a sine wave, it's going to take that fundamental and it's going to redistribute its energy based on whatever this audible frequency is into the carrier, into that audible oscillator, and then it's going to be redistributing based on the relationship, new harmonics, new sidebands. These might be consonant, they might be dissonant. Sadly, we can only push this up to 50 hertz or so, but we can still start to hear that effect. Especially if you start to kind of move between 40 and 50, you'll hear how that fundamental and that timbre of the sound seems to be changing a bit. And then we could also increase the depth. And that's going to have a big impact as well. And when we actually look at the FM4, this will all start to make a little bit more sense, but I just wanted to show you the very basic principle behind FM, and that's kind of really how it ended up being discovered, although we will do a much better discovery video moving forward. So with FM synthesis, envelopes are used to set the amount of modulation from the modulator onto the carrier. So we could hear that tone change. But with FM, what we have is control over that modulating frequency. So instead of that LFO just hitting all the time, we'd have like an ADSR envelope that could control how that oscillator was going to move. And an oscillator that has an independent envelope and can be used to modulate another oscillator is actually technically called an operator. And I think that term was coined by Yamaha with the DX7. But remember, it's just a word. It's not important to understanding FM. Just thought I'd throw it out there. Also with FM, we don't need any filters because we have that envelope control over each and every one of our operators. So with the envelope control on the operator, we can add and subtract harmonics where we please, as if we had a filter. The level of complexity or simplicity of the ratio between the modulator and the carrier, or between two modulators, or between three modulators and a carrier, determines whether or not the new harmonics, aka sidebands, will be consonant or dissonant. The concept of FM is incredibly simple, and in my opinion, it's just as simple as a subtractive synthesizer. However, the application and practice is a bit more difficult. You'll be hard-pressed to find an expert FM user, mainly because it's just such a nuanced and, I don't want to say difficult, but it's just a very nuanced and it's a very oral exploration into synthesis. You really have to use your ears to decide what you want and what you don't want. So when you're trying to like recreate that perfect string patch or that brass patch, you're going to be freaking working for hours and hours at a time. And, you know, I've never come across somebody and I've been like, hey, make me a really realistic string patch in an FM synthesizer. Most people will just look at you like you're freaking crazy. And most of the joy in FM, in my opinion, is just experimenting and seeing what you come up with. I should have proofread this, right? Because you really don't know what you can get until you go in there and try and push this thing as hard as it possibly can be pushed, which is what we'll be doing with the FM4. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, most of the time I have to restart a patch 10 or so times before I actually come up with something useful. My whole entire point of making this video is just for you guys to understand that FM is not that hard of a concept. You're only going to have to focus for about the next 30, 40, up to an hour or so, and you're going to really get FM. So thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.